Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we drift into the early twilight of the 20th century, settling down in the clamorous electric heart of New York City. Imagine yourself here, not standing on the sidewalk, but inside one of those newfangled gaslit brownstones, the kind where the mahogany gleam is just a little too polished, and the air smells faintly of expensive Turkish tobacco and desperation. You're holding a glass of something amber and smooth, maybe a pre-prohibition rye, and you're listening. Not to the frantic clip-clop of horses outside, but to a voice inside this room. A voice weaving a tapestry of impossible wealth, guaranteed returns, and the absolute certainty of your future success. This is where our story begins, in the glow of a promise. Tonight you're not tracking a notorious bank robber or a sensational murder, you're tracking a shadow. We're going after a ghost of the financial world, a master illusionist who didn't steal your watch. He convinced you to happily trade it for a clock made of smoke. We're pursuing the most successful grifter in history you've, almost certainly, never heard of. You've read about Charles Ponzi, of course, that loud theatrical Italian immigrant who slapped his name on an entire pyramid scheme, but Ponzi was a clumsy amateur in comparison. He was a bull in the china shop of deception. Our man? He was the porcelain doll that the bull lovingly carried out of the wreckage. He didn't just run a scam, he performed conceptual architecture. He built entire realities out of pure, confident sound and had the world sign the deed. I have to be honest with you. The sheer scale of his operations, how many governments and titans of industry he utterly bamboozled, it's astounding. You probably won't survive this journey with your faith in human intelligence intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And seriously, let me know where you're listening from and what time the sleepy history is finding you. It's always wild to see this community spanning the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle deeper into your chair, feeling the velvet of the upholstery scratch gently against your neck, and you realise something fundamental about the era. The turn of the century was the high watermark of human optimism and simultaneously human gullibility. Technology was a miracle drug. Electricity, the automobile, the telephone, all these things were proof that the impossible was just waiting for the right genius to unlock it. And our grifter, let's just call him the architect for now, understood that the best way to lie to people wasn't to tell them something false, but to tell them something possible that just happened to be delivered by a false person. Imagine walking the streets of Manhattan in 1904. The skyscrapers are scraping higher, the stock tickers are ticking faster, and every single person you pass believes that they are the one destined to strike it rich. They don't want a safe 5% return, they want a story, a shortcut, a keyhole view into the future. The architect knew this primal yearning. He was the product of this very environment, though he tried his best to disguise it. Our architect appears fully formed in the financial ledgers and police blotters around 1906, but even then, he's already using the second or third of what would become dozens of aliases. The name will eventually settle on for him, the one that stuck just long enough for the history books to smudge it out, was Victor Lustig. But trust me, Victor Lustig was just a very expensive suit worn by a much older ambition. His early exploits were the perfect training ground. They weren't headline-grabbing, which is why he remains in the historical shadows. He started small, using a confidence scheme known as the roulette system. Now, this isn't a complex physics-based cheating mechanism, it's a piece of psychological theatre. He would approach a wealthy but unsophisticated tourist, maybe one fresh off the train from Kansas, and lament about how much the house always wins. He would then propose a system, a guaranteed mathematically sound system naturally that could beat the wheel. He'd demonstrate it, placing small bets and winning meticulously. Then, he'd announce he was getting too nervous to risk his own growing capital, but for a small, non-refundable fee, say $500, he'd sell the system to you. You, the tourist, would eagerly buy the sheet of complex-looking, meaningless numbers. The architect would shake your hand, wish you luck, and vanish into the crowd, leaving you with a genuine feeling of gratitude for his generosity. The system, of course, lost money spectacularly, but by the time you realised it, you'd be hundreds of miles away, embarrassed, and entirely unable to describe the charming man who sold it to you. This was his first great lesson. The victim's own greed and embarrassment are your best defence. This isn't just theory, by the way. This meticulous method of conning people with their consent is part of a mainstream historical fact in the history of scamming. It's known as the Mexican prisoner, or Spanish prisoner, scam's intellectual cousin, the promise of a vast hidden fortune available only through a small upfront investment. But the architect applied it not to a mythical treasure chest, but to the cold, hard logic of numbers, which, in the early 1900s, felt far more credible to the new industrialist class than fairy tales about hidden gold. He was a tireless student of human weakness. He noticed, for instance, a quirky or fringe tidbit about the psychology of the affluent. They are generally terrible at negotiating small sums, but they are terrifyingly quick to gamble enormous sums. A wealthy man will argue over the price of a cab fare for 10 minutes, but he'll sign a promissory note for $50,000 after a 2-hour dinner. Why? Because the small sum is about his status. He doesn't want to be seen as being cheated, while the large sum is about his vision. It's a bet on his own. Superior intelligence and ability to spot a winner. The architect only targeted the big money deals, treating the small scams as practice and seed money. And while he was practicing, he was developing his look. Forget the movie stereotypes of the oily con artist in a cheap suit. Our man was impeccable. Custom-tailored 3-piece suits, silk ties imported from Paris, and a small, perfectly manicured moustache that signalled sophistication rather than bravado. Crucially, he spoke a perfect, unidentifiable English, tinged with just enough of an accent, maybe a faint German or Eastern European lilt, to make him sound exotic, mysterious, and most importantly, foreign. In this era of American industry booming, a sophisticated European veneer was a blank check for trustworthiness, a sign that you had travelled the world and understood the real money game that the provincial Americans were only just catching up to. His physical presence was as much a construct as his identity. He had a way of leaning in, of lowering his voice when discussing the crucial details, that made you feel like you were the only person in the room worthy of this sacred knowledge. He was an ASMR host before ASMR was a thing, lulling his marks into a state of drowsy, trusting compliance. Just sign here, my friend. Don't worry about the fine print. You and I, we are partners. This leads us to an important point that historians still argue whether the architect was operating alone, or if he was the product of a more formalised criminal network. Some scholars suggest his seamless transitions across countries and currencies, literally vanishing from one continent and reappearing on another weeks later, with a fresh, perfectly documented identity, points toward a well-oiled machine of identity brokers and document forgers. Others hold that his genius was purely solitary, arguing that his greatest strength was his ability to cut off all ties instantly, making him impervious to the betrayal that usually collapses a criminal syndicate. The truth, as we'll uncover, is likely a mix. He was the supreme conductor, but he occasionally rented out a tiny orchestra of useful accomplices, a temporary secretary who could convincingly fake a notarized document, a telegraph operator willing to send a few falsified urgent cables. They were tools, never partners, and always discarded before the police could connect them back to him. His time in New York was short but transformative. It was here he perfected his famous The Money Box scam, an iteration of an old trick but elevated to high art. He would present a small, finely crafted wooden box, sometimes called a Romanian box, that he claimed was a revolutionary invention capable of printing genuine US dollar bills. Of course, it was a slow process, taking 6 hours to process one note, which was the brilliant touch that made it believable. He would load a blank piece of paper into the machine in front of the mark, and 6 hours later produce a perfectly genuine $20 bill, which he had secretly loaded into a hidden compartment earlier. The mark would see the result, and their eyes would go wide. An automated printing press. The architect would reluctantly agree to sell the machine for, say, $50,000, explaining he was too busy with his global banking deals to be bothered with slow printing currency. The mark would hand over the fortune, take the box home, and spend the next week waiting for their investment to multiply, only to discover the box was entirely empty, mechanically speaking, save for a few cleverly placed slots and levers designed to deliver exactly 2 notes before jamming permanently. And then he would disappear, often taking a leisurely cruise across the Atlantic, already planning his next persona and his next target. He didn't flee, he simply relocated his genius. The New York phase was over. The American industrialist was easy prey, but the architect longed for a bigger, more sophisticated theatre for his performance. He was ready to charm the courts, the nobles, and the ancient money of Europe. He was ready to become a count. You remember that chill you felt when the architect, or Victor Lustig as we called the expensive suit, vanished from the docks of New York? Well, let that feeling settle in, because we're about to dive into the murky waters of his past, the before that no one ever saw. To understand a grifter of this magnitude, you have to realise that the genius lies not in the lies themselves, but in the foundation of plausible, if exaggerated, truth he built them upon. He didn't come from nothing, he came from almost nothing, and then he polished it. Forget the tales he spun later, the ones about impoverished Austro-Hungarian counts or Russian noble refugees fleeing the Bolsheviks. The reality is far more practical, and frankly, funnier. Our architect was likely born around 1890, in what was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, perhaps in a small town near Hostinec, modern-day Czech Republic. His name was something utterly unremarkable, probably a string of syllables like Robert Miller, or maybe even a slightly more exotic but common name like Count Robert von Waldheim. No one is entirely certain, which is exactly how he wanted it. The key fact, the mainstream historical fact often missed by those who focus only on his grand finale scams, is that his family background was one of the lower middle class, with a father who held a steady, respectable, but ultimately boring job, maybe a postmaster or a minor bureaucrat. This wasn't a family of starving peasants or revolutionary anarchists. It was a family of people who knew the rules. They knew how bureaucracy worked, they knew the power of a rubber stamp, and they understood the quiet, unshakable authority that came with a uniform, even a very minor one. This early exposure to the mechanics of the state, the way paper dictates reality, was the fertile ground for his confidence schemes. He learned early that legitimacy is just good presentation and a stamp of approval. Young Victor was apparently bright, quick, and critically, a disaster in a formal educational setting. He showed a stunning aptitude for languages, picking up German, Czech, French, and later English, with a seemingly effortless ear for dialect and accent. This linguistic dexterity became his superpower. It meant he didn't just speak a language, he could assume an entire cultural identity with it. He could be a formal Parisian banker one day, and a relaxed, slang-using American cowboy the next. This talent, as we know, is the foundation of every successful espionage agent, and, yes, every truly great con artist. His earliest cons weren't about money, they were about getting out of trouble. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit from his youth suggesting that as a teenager, he used his ability to mimic accents to escape a minor theft charge, something involving a stolen watch, ironically, or maybe a few bottles of fine wine. He reportedly convinced the local police that he was a distant relative of a powerful, respected magistrate from a neighbouring province, speaking in a highly formal, slightly archaic version of their local language. The police, fearing political repercussions for detaining a magistrate's nephew over a triviality, simply apologised and released him. The lesson was learned instantly. Fear of the higher authority is a grifter's best friend. You don't have to be the authority, you just have to convincingly pretend to be linked to it. He quickly graduated from petty scams to the first real confidence games, often targeting travellers on the nascent European rail network. Picture yourself on a train, trundling through the countryside between Vienna and Prague around 1910. The carriage is plush but stuffy, and you're feeling pleased with your progress. A charming, impeccably dressed young man, our architect, sits across from you. He begins a conversation not about money, but about philosophy or literature. He is engaging, erudite, and shows a profound respect for your opinions. This is the oldest trick. He disarms you with intelligence, not flattery. After an hour of pleasant conversation, he gently pivots. He laments the troubles of the aristocracy, which he hints he's part of, and how his family is trying to transfer a significant portion of their wealth, say a collection of valuable but hard-to-move antique gold coins, out of the country due to some obscure, newly enacted inheritance tax law. He doesn't need cash, he needs assistance. He needs a trustworthy person, that's you, obviously, to temporarily hold the valuable package until he can arrange the final transfer, and for your troubles he'll give you a generous fee right now. The catch? To prove your trustworthiness in handling his valuable family heirloom, he needs a small, refundable, good faith deposit. You hand over a few $100s. He gives you a heavy sealed wooden box, shakes your hand warmly, and promises to meet you at the next major station to finalise the exchange. You watch him alight at a minor stop, heading off with a confident stride. You wait at the major station and wait and wait. The heavy box, when you eventually break it open, is packed with lead weights and old newspapers. The real fortune he gained was your deposit, and the time delay ensured he was long gone before you realised the con. Historians still argue whether the architect was forced to leave Europe originally due to his increasingly successful railway scams, or if his transatlantic move to New York was a calculated business expansion. Some sources claim he was briefly detained by police in Germany, leading to his quick relocation to escape a growing file of aliases. Others posit he saw the raw, unrefined opportunity in the rapidly expanding American market, a place where new money was being made daily, and where European titles held enormous unearned respect. It was less a flight, and more a strategic market repositioning. We left him in the previous section having used New York as a masterclass, perfecting the money box and his charming, elusive persona. But we must never forget that the core of his success came from this early European training ground. The ability to size up a victim in minutes, identify their core vanity, and create a custom-tailored narrative that played directly into that vanity. He was a chameleon who didn't just change colours, he changed species. Think about the psychological profile he must have developed. He had to be entirely devoid of common human emotions like guilt or sustained connection, yet capable of faking profound friendship and empathy. He was a mirror reflecting the victim's best self. If you saw yourself as a shrewd businessman, he was your visionary partner. If you saw yourself as a cultured intellectual, he was your philosophizing colleague. He sold people a better version of themselves, and you can't put a price on that feeling. He was also ruthless about his own brand maintenance. He never spent too long in one place under one name. He understood the exponential risk involved. Every successful scam increased his notoriety, even if only among the small private circle of the fleeced, and every failure chipped away at his confidence. Therefore, he never allowed himself to be pressured into a quick, sloppy job. His operations were masterpieces of patience, often taking weeks of painstaking social engineering before the final ask was ever made. You have to admire the efficiency. He didn't need guns or violence. He needed only a tailor, a printer for fake letterhead, a steady hand, and the unwavering belief that you were dumber than he was. And here's the kicker. For a surprisingly long time, most people were. The New York chapter, though short, was his official graduation. When he boarded that ship bound back for Europe, not as a runaway, but as a gentleman of means, he was carrying something far more valuable than the cash from the money box scam. He was carrying the American blueprint for scale. He realized that European society, with its fixed hierarchies and ancient respect for titles, was ripe for the picking if approached with the aggressive, no-holds-barred confidence he had absorbed in the States. He was no longer trying to defraud a solitary tourist on a train. He was going to defraud institutions, entire social strata, and perhaps, with enough luck, an entire government. His next stop was not a crowded railway station, but the opulent, tightly knit social scene of the French Riviera. He understood that European noblesse often had ancient titles but modern problems, specifically the slow, grinding poverty that comes when you only have land and prestige, but no actual cash. The American model he had perfected, promising dizzying, high-tech or resource-heavy returns on a quick investment, would be absolute catnip to these cash-poor, status-rich aristocrats. He was sailing back to Europe to sell them their own history, only wrapped in a glossy financial package. He was ready to elevate his game from selling a fake money box to selling, well, the Brooklyn Bridge. You're back on the move now, sensing the gentle sway of the transatlantic steamer as it slices through the early morning fog of the Atlantic. Our architect isn't hiding in a cramped second-class cabin. He's on the upper deck, leaning on the rail, inhaling the salt air and, more importantly, observing the other passengers. This journey back to Europe is not a retreat, it's a transition ceremony. He has shed the rough edges of his New York alias and is preparing to don a new, more gilded identity, one that will resonate with the established, rigid social strata of the continent. He understood something profound. A name isn't just a label, it's a narrative contract. When you introduce yourself as Mr. Smith, a commodities broker from Chicago, people expect a certain demeanour, a certain set of jokes, and a certain kind of cheap cigar. But when you introduce yourself as Count Victor Lustig, as he was beginning to do now, you are handing them a story rich with intrigue, old-world class, and an implied ancient wealth. The art of the name change, for him, wasn't about hiding, it was about elevating. It wasn't just swapping Robert Miller for Victor Lustig. It was about ensuring that every piece of documentation, from the passport to the letterhead to the monogram on the silver cigarette case, told the exact same story, in beautiful, consistent detail. To manage this, he utilised a network that was loose but effective. He cultivated relationships with minor, low-paid embassy staff and high-end but discreet document forgers in the great capitals of Europe, Paris, Vienna and London. He didn't use them all at once, which would be clumsy. He used them sequentially. The Count Lustig passport, for instance, might have been expertly faked in Prague, but the accompanying Count Lustig bank letters of reference were purchased from a small, crooked bank manager in Switzerland who was paid a handsome fee for confirming the existence of a substantial but non-existent account. This sophisticated approach to identity creation is a mainstream historical fact often associated with spies, but our Grifter mastered it for purely financial gain. During this period, before the rise of centralised international policing, like Interpol, a well-executed false passport, backed by one or two seemingly legitimate letters of reference, was essentially bulletproof. National borders were soft boundaries for anyone who looked and acted like they belonged to the international elite. Now picture the architect, or Count Lustig, arriving in Paris. He doesn't check into the most ostentatious hotel. That's the mark of new money. He checks into a smaller, impeccably discreet hotel near the Place Vendôme, known for its old money clientele and its ability to keep secrets. He begins socialising, not with the industrial elite, but with the decaying nobility, the ones who still have the title and the chateau, but who are terrified of losing the chateau because the roof needs replacing and the land taxes are crushing them. He doesn't pitch a scam. He pitches an opportunity. He introduces himself as a specialist in international asset transference and discreet liquidation, hinting that he manages the tangled finances of various exiled or embattled royal families. He wears a subtle but expensive watch that catches the light just right and tells jokes in flawless French, sometimes slipping into a comfortable German or Russian depending on his interlocutor. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly illustrates his commitment to the bit. He reportedly commissioned a small fictional family crest, a relatively simple design involving a stylized eagle and a motto in Latin, translating roughly to "Silence is golden." He had this crest subtly embroidered onto the interior lining of his coat and engraved on his signet ring. It wasn't meant to be obvious, it was meant to be glimpsed. If a potential mark saw the crest, asked about it, and the architect demurred modestly, "Oh, just an old family thing, quite boring actually," the mark's imagination would instantly fill in a century of glorious history. He understood that the best backstory is the one the victim writes for you. His name changes and subsequent narratives were so effective that historians still argue whether certain early, less documented cons should even be attributed to him. Was the Russian Grand Duke who fleeced Viennese jewellers in 1911 the same man who sold bogus oil shares in Cannes in 1913? The physical description is similar. The modus operandi is identical, but the names and nationalities are completely different. This ambiguity, this historical fog, is his masterpiece. He made himself impossible to definitively catalogue. This whole period of early 1910s Europe was a period of consolidation for him. He perfected his infamous The Ten Commandments of the Con Man, a kind of personal operating manual that became legendary among police investigators, and later among a few true crime writers. These weren't moral guidelines, obviously. They were rules for maintaining the performance. Rules like be a patient listener and never get drunk, and perhaps most crucially, never let the victim know he's been conned. The victim must leave the encounter believing they were either unlucky or stupid, but never that they were facing a master criminal. He knew that if you fleece a man of 500 francs, he reports it. If you convince him to invest 100,000 francs in a spectacularly unsuccessful but plausible venture, he simply tells his wife he lost money on a bad deal, protecting his pride and, by extension, protecting you. This is the core difference between a thief and a grifter. The grifter extracts money not through force, but through self-delusion. One of the scams he honed during this time was the cattle futures diversion. He would secure a small legitimate contract to broker livestock sales between a few minor European farms, something utterly boring and real. He would then use this contract's official letterhead and seals to leverage a much, much bigger deal. He would approach a genuine industrialist, claiming that this small contract was merely the pilot project for a massive, secret infrastructure plan backed by an unnamed royal family, say building a new railway spur to move 10 times that amount of livestock. He would need a discreet 7-figure investment to secure the right of first refusal on the land. You, the industrialist, would see the small legitimate paperwork and assume the massive project was simply too secret to have its own public documents yet. The grifter never had to show you the massive project, only the tantalising real-world proof that he was involved in something real. He'd take your money, pay the small farmers a very nice sum, ensuring their loyalty and silence, and then simply declare the massive project was put on indefinite hold due to unforeseen political turbulence in the unnamed royal family's country. The money was gone, but the explanation was too classy to be criminal. He was a master of the exit strategy. For the grifter, the most dangerous moment is the period immediately following the transfer of funds. A thief runs, the architect sailed. He would ensure his exit was as elegant and pre-planned as his entry. Often, he'd book a first-class ticket out of the country before he even made the pitch, scheduling the sailing or train departure for 3 days after the planned payoff. This enforced timeline meant he couldn't stall or get sloppy, and it created a physical and psychological buffer between him and the moment the Mark realised they had been played. By the time the Marks realised they had handed their savings to Count Lustig, the Count was already on a train heading south, ready to become Baron Waldheim, a man with an entirely new backstory, a new set of tailored suits, and a fresh list of opportunities. This constant liquid transition was the true backbone of his long career. The name change was not just a protective measure, it was the engine of his ambition. He was preparing for his biggest move yet, the complete spectacular destruction of someone else's reputation in exchange for a staggering amount of cash. He had sold fake documents and fake boxes. Now he was ready to sell something much, much bigger, a spectacular illusion of tangible, massive worth that was in fact absolutely worthless. You might recall the famous cliched phrase, "If you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you." It's the universal shorthand for maximum gullibility. What you probably don't know is that the man who popularised the concept wasn't a cartoon character. He was our architect. He didn't invent the idea of selling a public landmark, but he executed it with such breathtaking audacity and realism that the legend became inseparable from his career, even if he didn't technically pull off the Brooklyn Bridge scam itself. That honour belongs to another forgotten grifter, George C. Parker. Our architect, however, applied the underlying philosophy to something far grander and more complex: the sale of state property. Having mastered the minor leagues of aristocrat fleecing on the Riviera, Count Lustig, let's stick with that name for a while, as it was the one he truly polished, set his sights on Paris in 1925. Paris was, even then, the crown jewel of Europe, proud, elegant and deeply bureaucratic. And it was this bureaucracy, this reliance on stamped paper and officialdom that he planned to use as his weapon. His target was not a single, lonely tourist. His target was the entire scrap metal industry of France. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity and relied on a single powerful truth. Governments are often terrible at selling off their own assets. He started small, as always. He secured expertly forged stationery from the French Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. This is the mainstream historical fact that makes the scam plausible. In the 1920s, official government letterheads and seals were surprisingly easy to replicate, and the assumption of bureaucratic competence was so strong that few people ever dared to question a document that looked suitably official. Lustig then sent out 6 identical, highly confidential letters, marked private and confidential and urgent, to the 6 leading scrap metal dealers in Paris. The letters introduced him as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry handling a matter of utmost national secrecy. The content of the letters was a masterpiece of political and financial manoeuvring. It stated, with great regret, that due to structural decay and the prohibitive cost of maintenance, the government had decided that the Eiffel Tower must be dismantled and sold for scrap. Yes, you heard that right. He decided to sell the Eiffel Tower. You might be thinking, the Eiffel Tower? How could anyone believe that? But remember the context. The Eiffel Tower was originally built for the 1889 World's Fair and was intended to be temporary. By the 1920s, It was over 30 years old, seen by many aesthetic critics as an ugly, outdated monument to industrial blight. There had in fact been genuine historical debates and calls for its demolition over the decades. Lustig didn't invent the idea, he simply leveraged an existing half-forgotten public debate. The letter invited the 6 dealers to a private, extremely secret meeting at a luxurious but low-key Parisian hotel to discuss the sealed bids for the approximately 7,000 tons of puddled iron and steel that the tower was composed of. The air of absolute secrecy was crucial. It ensured that the men wouldn't talk to each other, to the press, or, God forbid, to anyone at the actual ministry. The secrecy was the net he cast to trap them in their own greed. At the hotel, Lustig put on a performance worthy of the Comédie Française. He received the men, not in a grand ballroom, but in a small, slightly shabby private suite, emphasising the covert nature of the deal. He spoke in a voice hushed with the gravitas of a high-ranking official burdened by an unpleasant duty. He laid out the technical specifications for the dismantling, citing completely fabricated but highly detailed engineering reports. He even included a quirky or fringe tidbit in his pitch. He lamented the political opposition to the demolition, claiming that certain sentimental, artistically inclined groups were making the process difficult, necessitating the need for absolute speed and discretion in handling the sale. This wasn't just a lie, it was a justification for the secret bidding process and a warning not to speak to the media. 5 of the 6 scrap dealers were cautious, smelling either a rat or simply too large a piece of cheese. They submitted conservative, legitimate bids and then went home to wait, occasionally calling the ministry and being politely stonewalled by real low-level clerks who had no idea what they were talking about. But the 6th dealer, a man named André Poisson, was different. Poisson was ambitious and slightly insecure in Paris's old money circles. He didn't just want the tower's scrap metal, he wanted the prestige of having clinched this historically significant, immensely profitable and highly secretive deal. He saw this as his ticket into the highest tiers of French industry. Lustig saw this hunger immediately. The fake Deputy Director General met with Poisson again, privately, and expressed a calculated faux distress. He confessed, in a deep whisper, that while Poisson's bid was excellent, his modest salary as a public servant made the process financially difficult. He explained that in the post-war bureaucracy, life was hard, and it was difficult to maintain his dignity while handling such immense sums of national wealth. The implication was clear. I need a bribe. This was the final, brilliant layer of the con. By soliciting a bribe, Lustig instantly separated himself from the common criminal. A crook demands money for the scam, an official demands money for the favour. By paying the bribe, Poisson didn't feel like he was being conned. He felt like he was insider trading. He believed he was cementing a partnership, ensuring his bid was selected, and participating in the subtle, necessary corruption that lubricated the wheels of power. He paid the bribe, a significant 5-figure sum, and then wrote the cheque for the Eiffel Tower contract price. Lustig took the money, secured the contracts, and promptly boarded the Orient Express, heading straight for Vienna, leaving behind a baffled scrap magnate and an undismantled iron lady. He didn't just sell the Brooklyn Bridge, he sold the Eiffel Tower twice. Yes, he came back a month later and tried the exact same scam on a new set of victims, though the second attempt failed when the nervous Mark called the police. Historians still argue whether the initial failure to report the first Eiffel Tower scam immediately was due to Poisson's profound sense of personal humiliation, or if it was due to a genuine fear of admitting to a bribe. Many scholars lean toward the latter, suggesting that the grifter's brilliance was in making his victims legally complicit, ensuring their silence was self-enforced. The Eiffel Tower scam was Lustig's calling card. It was a massive financial haul, but more importantly, it proved that his system of using official-looking documents, combined with a keen understanding of human pride and corruption, could work on an exponential scale. Think about the psychological toll on Poisson. He couldn't go to the police and say, "I paid a massive bribe to buy the Eiffel Tower and now the guy's gone." He would have had to explain his greed, his attempts at corruption, and his stunning gullibility. It was easier to write it off as an eccentric loss and keep his mouth shut. That silence was Lustig's safety margin, the one he had established back in his early railway cons, now applied to an international masterpiece of fraud. He arrived in Vienna basking in the glow of his Parisian success, flush with cash and brimming with confidence. The scrap metal world was now on the alert, but the banking world, The art world and the nobility were still ripe. He spent the next few months living like a minor prince, consolidating his wealth and, most importantly, laundering the money through a series of shell corporations across Europe. He was meticulous. Every franc he spent had to be untraceable back to the sale of the world's most recognisable structure. But the biggest takeaway from the Eiffel Tower was the shift in his identity. He was no longer a petty con artist. He was a man who handled geopolitical scale transactions. And that required a new name, a new title, and a move away from transient European capitals toward the stability and prestige of the British Empire. He was ready to stop just playing a count and start acting like a king. You're catching your breath, still stunned by the audacity of selling the Eiffel Tower, but our architect, still holding tight to the name Count Victor Lustig for the moment, isn't waiting for you to recover. His train ride from Paris to Vienna wasn't a relaxing jaunt. It was a high-speed strategy session. He knew that the moment Poisson broke his silence, however unlikely that seemed, Paris would become hot. Therefore, the next phase had to be fluid, international, and geographically dispersed. It was time for the architect's European grand tour of deceit. This wasn't aimless travel, it was calculated movement, targeting cities based on the psychological profile of their wealthy inhabitants. Paris was for bureaucracy and pride, Vienna was for old-world tradition and nostalgia, Monte Carlo was for pure, unadulterated gambling addiction, and London was for established banking and institutional rigidity. He needed to prove he could beat them all. In Vienna, he capitalised on the lingering melancholy of the collapsed Austro-Hungarian Empire. The city was full of impoverished aristocracy, people who had titles and beautiful drawing rooms, but whose family fortunes had been decimated by war and economic collapse. Lustig didn't sell them scrap metal, he sold them history. He introduced himself as a curator, a man deeply involved in retrieving lost artefacts and liquidated assets from the former royal families. His con here was subtle and focused on small, high-yield targets. He would approach a genuine but financially struggling baroness, for example, and offer to purchase a minor piece of family artwork, say, a small, unremarkable silver tray, for a huge sum, far above its market value. Why? Because, he would whisper conspiratorially, the silver tray held a secret embedded map or code that led to a vast hidden cache of imperial gold. He would complete the purchase, often paying a legitimate high price for the tray to secure trust. Then, a week later, he'd return, frantic and distressed. The code was real, he'd explain, but the government of a newly formed nation had caught wind of the treasure and was demanding a 5-figure facilitation fee to allow the transport of the gold out of their territory. He was willing to put up most of the money, but he needed the Baroness to contribute a portion, a small percentage, to complete the necessary bribe and secure the vast shared fortune. This mainstream historical fact, that post-WWI Europe was littered with truly lost treasures and collapsing national boundaries, made his story terrifyingly plausible. The victims saw the initial high payout for the silver tray as proof of his honesty, and the facilitation fee as the final necessary hurdle before untold riches. They willingly handed over their last few thousand florins, believing they were investing in the return of their family's lost glory, only for Lustig to disappear with the money and the perfectly legitimate silver tray. While in Vienna, he engaged in a quirky or fringe tidbit that demonstrates his talent for theatre. He allegedly won a significant sum in a highly public, high-stakes poker game against a genuinely high-ranking count. When the count was slow to produce the cash, Lustig didn't threaten him. He pulled out a gold-plated fountain pen and a ledger, and had the count sign a promissory note for the amount, countersigned by 2 prominent witnesses. Lustig then immediately tore up the note in front of everyone, declaring that the count's honour was worth more than the money, thereby instantly turning a victim into a devoted friend and a willing character reference for future scams. He understood that sometimes the best investment you can make is in your reputation for magnanimity. His tour continued to the French Riviera, where he temporarily dropped the Count title and became Mr. Roberts, an American investor. Here, the goal was simple: target the casino environment. He wasn't playing the tables, he was preying on the losers. He would approach the wealthy gentleman who had just blown a fortune on the roulette wheel, a man whose judgment was already shot through with desperation, and offer him the money box scam again. But this time framed as a secret device designed to print counterfeit French francs, the ultimate revenge against the house. The context was different, the mark was different, But the mechanical con remained the same, a trusted classic in his repertoire. This constant self-reinventing movement meant he was always one step ahead of the few police officers who were actually connecting the dots. His method relied on the fact that communication between European police forces in the 1920s was glacial and fragmented. By the time a report went from Paris to Vienna, Lustig was already in London. Ah, London. The city of banks, fog, and unshakable seriousness. This was the ultimate test. The British financial system was not based on aristocratic vanity or emotional desperation. It was based on cold, hard due diligence. Lustig arrived in London with a carefully constructed new identity that blended his European veneer with American commercial savvy. He was now Baron Henri von Waldheim, a man with a legitimate-sounding minor Prussian title who just happened to be an expert in the burgeoning American oil industry. He rented a small but hugely prestigious office address in the City of London, furnished it with hired antiques and a conspicuously large safe, and began to wait. He didn't seek out small fish. He targeted major financial institutions with a scheme so dry, so technically complex, that it was inherently hard to disbelieve. He claimed to have secured the exclusive European distribution rights for a revolutionary new type of oil exploration sensor, developed by a secretive American research firm. He had the contracts, the blueprints, all fake but stamped with impressive official-looking American corporate seals, and the testimonials. The documents were boring, dense, and full of impenetrable technical jargon, all designed to signal genuine high-level business. He sought capital from genuine, established London financiers to form a new Anglo-American joint venture. He didn't promise absurd returns. He promised a slow, steady, and inevitable 10%, backed by legitimate-looking collateral in the form of shares in the secretive American firm. The collateral was worthless, of course, but the paperwork was impeccable. The financial transaction was handled with such formality, multiple meetings, dry negotiations over fine points of law, and the involvement of genuine but compromised London notaries, that the financiers were utterly convinced. They saw the transaction as a low-risk, high-prestige entry into the lucrative American technology sector. This London con illustrates a critical distinction that historians still argue whether the architect's success was primarily due to his personal charisma or to the quality of his forgery. Some scholars contend that the quality of his fake documents, the paper stock, the typefaces, the rubber stamps, was so consistently high that it overcame any lingering suspicion. Others maintain that no amount of fancy paper could replace his ability to maintain a performance under pressure, suggesting his charm and confidence were the primary tools. Given his ability to manipulate André Poisson into paying a bribe, it seems likely the personality was the primary weapon, with the paperwork serving as the final necessary validation. By the time the London financiers started asking to see the actual sensor technology, a process Lustig had cleverly built a 6-month delay into, he had liquidated the investment capital into gold or diamonds and was gone, leaving behind only the ghost of a Prussian baron and a stack of expertly forged documents. His time on the European continent had been a phenomenal success. He had transitioned from a man who sold a fake printing box to someone who could convincingly sell a national landmark and broker multi-million-pound international oil deals. He had refined his persona, perfected his exit strategy, and most crucially, secured the capital needed for his final, most elaborate act, creating his own history. He was tired of renting titles. He was ready to forge a royal lineage and infiltrate the highest courts of Europe. The grand tour was over. The game was about to get truly aristocratic. You're now watching the ultimate act of self-creation. The money is secured from the Viennese barons and the London bankers. The passport of Baron Henri von Waldheim is expertly stamped, and the tailored suits are pressed. Our architect is no longer merely a confidence man, he is an identity artist. His goal is no longer just money, but a priceless, unbuyable commodity, pedigree. To achieve this, he knew he had to stop selling opportunities and start selling himself as the opportunity. This next phase, spanning the late 1920s, sees him operating with breathtaking proximity to genuine power. He is determined to penetrate the royal and pseudo-royal circles of Central and Southern Europe, a world defined by inherited titles, rigid protocol, and a desperate fear of being seen as nouveau riche. His entire strategy rested on a simple insight. Real royalty is too bored and too insulated to question someone who seems to belong. His chosen moniker for this grand performance was often Count Victor Lustig, the name he seemed to prefer when cash was the goal, or, occasionally, a more obscure title he fabricated entirely, like Count von Ho. The name didn't matter as much as the story attached to it. He crafted a lineage of extraordinary complexity, a mix of minor Austrian nobility, a long-lost connection to a Balkan principality, and a dash of exiled Russian grandeur. He even fabricated a heroic fictional military service record in the Great War, which appealed to the deeply traditional society he was targeting. He secured letters of introduction, again, expertly forged or simply purchased from genuinely compromised low-level dignitaries to open the first few doors. But once inside, the true genius was his performance. He mastered the arcane rules of European etiquette, which fork to use, how to address an archduke, when to speak, and most importantly, when to remain silently dignified. This rigorous adherence to protocol is a mainstream historical fact that allowed countless low-born social climbers to achieve status in rigid societies. The sheer effort of mastering the rules signalled to the old guard that he had been raised within them. Think of yourself watching him at a gala in Budapest or an estate dinner in Prague. He isn't loud, he doesn't boast about money. In fact, he often expresses a weary disdain for commerce. He drops hints of tragedy and exile, suggesting his immense wealth is simply the necessary byproduct of securing his family's ancient lands and interests. He presents himself not as a seller, but as a potential saviour, a man with impeccable connections and the liquid cash needed to solve a minor noble's permanent problem, e.g., funding a daughter's exorbitant dowry or saving a dilapidated family castle. This approach led to his most effective aristocratic con, the fading portrait scheme. He would identify an impoverished noble family with a genuine, but perhaps not hugely valuable ancestral portrait, a painting of a great-great-grandfather in a uniform. Lustig would express profound, almost tearful reverence for the family's heritage, and offer to temporarily acquire the portrait for an enormous fee. Why? He would claim that he was a trustee for a consortium of historians, or an unnamed royal collection that wished to preserve the image of such a great lineage, but for discretion, the sale must be temporary and highly confidential. The family, relieved to have cash without having to sell their actual land, would agree. Lustig would pay the money, take the portrait, and vanish. The money he paid, of course, was the final big payout from his previous London scam, which he was laundering as an asset purchase. The beauty was that the family couldn't report the theft or the swindle, because A, they had legally sold the portrait, and B, they were secretly hoping he would return in 6 months and offer a massive sum for a permanent sale, thereby making them even richer. He exploited their hope and their historical vanity. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit associated with this period that involved his temporary staff. He often hired elderly, down on their luck former servants of actual aristocratic families, a butler who knew the proper way to set a table for a duke, a footman who could correctly announce a count. He paid them exceptionally well for their service, often months in advance, and demanded absolute secrecy. These staff members, seeing him handle vast sums of cash and conduct himself with genuine elegance, genuinely believed he was a legitimate noble, lending an air of absolute authenticity to his rented homes and social engagements. He didn't just buy a title. He bought the trappings and validation of aristocracy. This continuous performance of being a man who can't be questioned raises the deep question that historians still argue whether the architect at some point began to believe his own fiction. Was the Count Lustig persona merely a mask, or did the decade-long performance fundamentally reshape his internal identity? Some scholars suggest his relentless self-creation was a form of psychological dissociation, allowing him to maintain moral distance from his crimes. Others argue that his later paranoia and eventual downfall show that the stress of maintaining the lie was always a grinding, conscious effort. He was the greatest actor who never starred in a film, and his audience was always trying to pay him for his performance. He wasn't merely socialising in these high-status circles, he was fishing for his next big financial target. The true value of these social excursions was gathering intelligence. He learned who was desperate for cash, whose family had secret business dealings, and crucially, which wealthy individuals were looking for a high-prestige, high-yield investment that the common market wouldn't touch. It was during one such grand evening, perhaps in a quiet drawing room in Berlin, that he encountered a wealthy, old-school industrialist, a man with genuine, tangible manufacturing assets, who confided that the complexity of moving his family's wealth across post-war European borders was becoming unbearable. The industrialist wanted to put a significant amount of capital somewhere safe, where it would earn slow, respectable returns and be immune from political volatility. He wanted a secret investment. The architect listened patiently, nodding sagely, lamenting the corruption of modern finance. He understood that this man didn't want a fake gold mine. He wanted something solid, patriotic, and just a little bit esoteric. He wanted to feel like he was funding a new era of enterprise. Lustig knew exactly what to pitch next. He was going to sell him a dream wrapped in nationalistic paper and sealed with an American stamp of approval. He was setting the stage for his first real, massive, cross-continental investment fraud, using all the theatrical and bureaucratic skills he had refined across 2 continents. He was moving past mere confidence games and into the realm of macro fraud. He had the name, he had the titles, and now he was going to weaponize the ultimate symbol of wealth and power. You're now at the apex of the performance, seated comfortably in a private members' club in the heart of London, circa 1928. The smell of polished leather and ancient wood fills the air, and the clinking of crystal glasses is the only soundtrack. Our architect, now transitioning back to his commercial alias, Count Victor Lustig, is perfectly at ease. He has successfully laundered his image and his cash among the European elite. He is rich, respected, and, thanks to his fabricated lineage, unassailable on a superficial level. It is time to execute a financial plan so colossal that it requires the full weight of his accumulated theatrical and administrative skills. The target is no longer the scrap dealer or the struggling baroness. It's the established financial power structure, hardened investment bankers, industrialists and seasoned speculators who pride themselves on their ability to spot a bad deal. He knew they wouldn't fall for fake passports or temporary bribes. They required a seemingly legitimate capital-intensive venture that promised exclusivity and massive long-term reward. His chosen vehicle, the South African Diamond Syndicate. Lustig had spent months cultivating a relationship with a small conservative group of city financiers. He never rushed the pitch. He began by discussing genuine mainstream historical facts about the volatility of the diamond market, the real-life control exerted by figures like Cecil Rhodes and the immense wealth being generated in the colonial outposts of Africa. This anchoring in reality was essential. He spoke with the quiet authority of an insider who understood the scarcity and the price controls. His narrative was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. He claimed to represent a secretive family that had discovered an entirely new, unregistered diamond pipe deep in the interior of a British colonial possession, perhaps Rhodesia or southwest Africa. This was not a tiny operation. It was described as a massive geological anomaly, a source of industrial-grade diamonds so vast it could destabilize the established De Beers cartel. The crucial detail was the secrecy. He explained that to protect the market and the immense political leverage this discovery represented, the family needed to finance the initial infrastructure and extraction without involving the major public mining houses or the colonial government, which would certainly try to seize it. Therefore, they needed private, discreet capital from trusted, non-competitive sources. That's you and your partners, naturally. You, the astute financier, are sceptical, as any good investor should be. You demand proof. This is where Lustig truly shines. He doesn't just present documents, he stages an entire due diligence opera. First, the documents. He produces a thick dossier of geological surveys and assay reports complete with Latin-sounding terms and complex chemical notations, all flawlessly forged with seals and stamps from non-existent, but official-sounding colonial geological societies. He uses his mastery of language to fill the documents with confusing, impressive jargon. Second, the sample. He doesn't hand you a bag of rough diamonds. That would be too cheap. He hands you 1 or 2 perfectly cut, genuine, industrial-grade diamonds, small but undeniably real, claiming they were extracted during the initial exploratory drilling. These real diamonds, purchased for a small fortune in Antwerp, served as the undeniable, tangible proof. Third, the expert. He would introduce an accomplice, often a temporary hire, who was an older, distinguished-looking gentleman. A former engineer or university professor paid handsomely to play the role of the independent mining consultant. This man would confirm Lustig's story with quiet, measured authority and field technical questions with believable, if vague, answers. This human validation was key to getting the deal across the line. The scheme demanded enormous capitalisation, usually starting in the mid-six figures. Lustig didn't ask for the money all at once. He structured the deal in tranches, claiming the funds were needed sequentially for land lease, equipment purchase, and finally, transport logistics. This phased approach made the investors feel they were in control, signing off on legitimate-sounding milestones. The quirky or fringe tidbit that accompanies this scam involves his use of telegrams. To keep the urgency high, Lustig would occasionally receive fake urgent telegrams in the middle of a meeting, purportedly from his colleagues in Africa, reporting a massive, unexpected yield or a political difficulty. He would translate the German or French cable to his English investors with a look of stressed excitement, confirming the risk and the massive reward. These manufactured moments of high drama were designed to bypass rational thought and trigger the investors' fear of missing out. The final brilliance of the diamond mine scam was its complexity. He never claimed the diamonds were already there and ready to ship. He claimed the infrastructure was the core investment. By the time the investors decided to send an actual, genuine representative to the remote corners of Africa to check on the mine, Lustig had already spent 6 months liquidating the funds, creating a dozen new shell companies, and was operating under a completely different alias in a different hemisphere. The man they sent would find nothing but empty bush and the remains of a single, small, abandoned drill rig, and absolutely no trace of Count Lustig. This is the point where historians still argue whether the architect was actively collaborating with any major organised crime figures during this period, or if his operations were truly solo. The scale of the Diamond Syndicate required intricate money laundering and logistics that seemed beyond the scope of a single individual, suggesting a need for a deep, if temporary, association with professional financiers, even if those financiers were merely unwitting fronts for his operations. The diamond mine scam and several similar resource-based frauds he ran in London and Amsterdam solidified two things. First, it made him enormously wealthy, giving him access to liquid capital that few men in the world possessed outside of genuine banking families. Second, it made him extremely dangerous. He now had the resources to move across borders instantly, bribe low-level officials for years, and fund an entirely new life. He was no longer just running scams, he was running a shadow economy. The financial pressure from the defrauded English financiers began to mount slowly. They were discreet. They didn't want to admit they were fooled, but they hired private investigators. Lustig, always anticipating the consequences, knew the continent was growing too small for his ambitions. Europe was entering a period of economic instability, and more ominously, political upheaval. The chaos of a global conflict was looming, and where others saw destruction, the architect saw the greatest, most profitable opportunity of his life. He prepared to exit the world of high society and enter the terrifying, lucrative world of international wartime commodity speculation. You sense the shift in the global atmosphere, a tightening of political belts and a nervous shuffling of currencies. It is the late 1920s and early 1930s. The diamond mine scam has run its course, netting our architect a staggering fortune, but also attracting unwanted attention from Scotland Yard and a consortium of vengeful investors. He needed an exit strategy that was not just physical, but existential. He found it in the shadow of the looming economic depression and the subsequent build-up to a major European conflict. Where others saw financial ruin and the collapse of peace, our Grifter, now operating under a variety of short-lived, highly professional aliases like Robert V. Miller or Comte de Tournai, saw liquidity and chaos. The greatest commodity in an unstable world is not gold or diamonds, or even currency. It is access to critical resources. This became his focus. He transitioned from defrauding individuals with high-concept schemes to running a large-scale cross-border scheme involving strategic materials, perfectly leveraging the panic that precedes a major war. His grand new venture was the Strategic Material Acquisition Syndicate, a scheme so massive it felt more like a state-sponsored enterprise than a con. The core lie was that he was secretly brokering the sale of enormous, crucial stockpiles of materials. Copper, rubber, nitrates, and, most lucratively, uranium, or whatever heavy rare metal was strategically crucial at the time, which he always claimed was necessary for next-generation national defence. This whole operation hinged on a specific mainstream historical fact. The period between the two world wars saw unprecedented, frantic and often clandestine rearmament and resource acquisition by major powers. Governments, anxious about supply lines, were willing to bypass official channels, ignore due diligence, and deal directly with shadowy intermediaries to secure a competitive edge. The atmosphere of national security allowed him to demand absolute secrecy and astronomical upfront facilitation fees. He would approach industrialists and military contractors in neutral countries, Switzerland, Belgium, and later the United States, claiming to represent either a desperate European power, needing quick, untraceable supplies, or a major American corporation, needing foreign resources kept off the domestic books. His method was simple but devastatingly effective: the three-layer shell game. The seller, layer 1, a fake company registered in a tax haven, e.g. Liechtenstein or Panama, that supposedly controlled the resource stockpile. This company had an official-looking corporate seal and impressive but untraceable letterhead. The broker, layer 2, his current alias, the Count Baron Mr. Miller, acting as the discreet, highly placed intermediary who demanded the initial non-refundable commission, the finder's fee. This fee was the pure profit. The guarantee, layer 3, he would secure a small, genuine contract to move a tiny fraction of the material, using the funds from the finder's fee to pay a genuine, legitimate supplier for a symbolic shipment. For instance, if he promised 10,000 tons of copper, he would actually arrange for a shipment of 50 tons. This small, legitimate transaction served as proof of concept to his buyer. See, I told you I could get the material. The rest is coming soon. Once the small shipment was delivered, his buyer's fears vanished, replaced by euphoria. They had proof. They had a source. They quickly handed over the full massive sum for the remaining 9,950 tons. Of course, the remaining 9,950 tons existed only in his fictional company ledger. By the time the buyers realized the supply chain had snapped, often blaming the complex politics of resource acquisition, Lustig was long gone. He wasn't just wealthy, he was now operating on a scale that actually impacted international balance sheets. He acquired assets, properties, and liquid funds across a dozen jurisdictions. This wealth wasn't just for luxury, it was for survival. He established multiple fail-safe escape routes, funded a complex network of informers, and even acquired ownership interests in a few small, obscure shipping companies to ensure he could physically move himself and his assets instantly. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly encapsulates his sense of humour and arrogance during this period. While running his major resource scams, he took time to perpetrate a small but perfectly executed side hustle. He sold stock in a completely fictitious high-altitude balloon company that he claimed was developing a revolutionary new system for long-range, weather-immune airmail. He pitched it only to other professional swindlers he met through intermediaries, promising them an inside track on a surefire mark, the public. He literally conned con men. He viewed this as a professional courtesy, a way of proving he was at the very top of the food chain. This period of global chaos raises the pivotal question that historians still argue whether the architect was simply an opportunist, or if he possessed genuine political and economic foresight. Some suggest his uncanny ability to time his operations, extracting huge sums just before major global events like bank collapses or military invasions, indicates he had high-level intelligence sources inside European chancelleries and finance ministries. Others argue that he simply understood the inherent instability of the post-World War I economy and was merely a brilliant gambler who bet consistently on human greed and bureaucratic incompetence. He knew that during times of crisis, everyone, from generals to bankers, is desperate for a shortcut. The climax of his global scamming came when he tried to pull his ultimate confidence trick on the United States Treasury Department. He had achieved such notoriety in underground circles and amassed such a fortune that he attracted the attention of genuine high-level American mobsters, including Al Capone's organization. In a move of staggering confidence, Lustig travelled to the United States. He wasn't there to hide, he was there to operate. He met with Capone's people and proposed a daring final version of his money box scam. He claimed to have a printing plate and process so advanced it could counterfeit $100 bills perfectly, requiring only a $50,000 investment to complete the final, secret machinery. Capone, intrigued but wary, agreed to the investment. Lustig took the money, but, for the first time, he didn't run immediately. He kept in close contact with the mobsters, stalling for weeks, claiming technical difficulties, broken parts, or the need for a crucial, final chemical ingredient. This wasn't cowardice, it was planning. After 2 months, realizing that the mob was losing patience, Lustig returned the full $50,000 to Capone, apologizing profusely and claiming the machine was simply impossible to perfect, giving him back the original notes with a look of genuine disappointment. Capone, accustomed to violence and betrayal, was utterly shocked. A man who returned money was, in his world, a man of absolute unshakable integrity. When Lustig then immediately pitched Capone on a different investment, a simpler, less spectacular, but highly lucrative cattle-rustling venture, Capone gave him the investment and added another $10,000 on top, convinced he was dealing with the only honest man in the world. Lustig, having established this ironclad reputation, promptly vanished with the second, much larger sum, proving that sometimes the only way to earn trust is to return the first amount of money. He leveraged the chaos of empires and the greed of gangsters, using the immense profits from his global resource scams to live a life of untouchable luxury, always keeping the police, the spurned investors, and now the mob perpetually one step behind. His biggest challenge was no longer the victims but the authorities themselves. The game was about to move from fraud to pure evasion. You feel the heat now, not just from the tension of the narrative, but from the actual professional pursuit closing in. The year is the early 1930s. The architect, in his guise as Count Lustig, has achieved the kind of notoriety that transcends national police forces. His global resource scams and his outrageous manoeuvre in fleecing Al Capone, and living to tell the tale, mean he is now a target for organised crime, major financial institutions, and most critically various national intelligence and law enforcement agencies. This is the cat-and-mouse game elevated to a geopolitical level, and the only way to win is to remain an unpredictable, constantly shifting target. His evasion strategy was not based on luck or brute force, it was based on bureaucratic friction and information control. He understood that the greatest weakness of large institutions is their inability to share information effectively across jurisdictions, especially in an era without standardized international databases or rapid communication technology. He was being hunted by at least 3 major groups simultaneously: Scotland Yard/European investors, vengeful financiers from the diamond mine scam, employing top-tier private detectives and pushing for formal extradition. The US Secret Service, T-Men, focused on the counterfeiting aspect of his schemes, the money box and the attempted Capone con, as counterfeiting US currency was a federal crime that the Treasury Department took extremely seriously. The mob, specifically Al Capone's people, who were less concerned with legal justice and more concerned with physical retribution and recovering their investment. To counter this triple threat, he established a sophisticated system of instantaneous metamorphosis. He didn't just change his name, he changed his nationality, his backstory, his primary language, and his mode of transport. He might spend a week as a Danish art dealer in Paris, and the next as a wealthy Chilean rancher in Rome. Every passport was meticulously forged, often sourced from small, neutral nations that had less stringent reporting requirements. This mastery of document fraud is a mainstream historical fact that characterized top-tier international criminals and spies in the interwar period, before centralized records made it nearly impossible. The physical escape routes were equally meticulous. He rarely travelled by obvious routes. He might take a train from Berlin to Trieste, then a fishing boat across the Adriatic, and finally a long rail journey through the Balkans, instead of simply boarding a direct flight or ocean liner. He understood that the shortest distance between 2 points is often the most heavily watched. There's a fascinating, quirky or fringe tidbit from the Secret Service files detailing an attempt to apprehend him in Chicago. Agents reportedly staked out a lavish hotel suite registered to a Mr. A.V. Thompson. The agents confirmed Thompson was Lustig's alias, but when they raided the room, they found only a single, expensive suitcase containing immaculate, freshly laundered clothing, a partially written letter in Hungarian, and a ticket stub for a train to Mexico City departing 4 days earlier. The clothing was still warm from the pressing iron. Lustig wasn't physically in the room, but he had staged a perfect theatrical performance of having just been there, buying him days of delay as the agents investigated the empty evidence. He was always running ahead of the chase, leaving breadcrumbs to mislead his pursuers. his greatest operational asset was his network of paid informants. Unlike a mob boss, his informants were not criminal associates. They were minor officials, custom agents, telegraph operators, hotel receptionists, and low-level police clerks in major cities were paid small, regular stipends to simply report back to a designated anonymous mailbox whenever a suspicious person, specifically a sharp-dressed foreigner asking about a list of his known aliases, showed up. He created a decentralized, personalized early warning system that was far faster and more efficient than the bureaucratic communication of his pursuers. This relentless evasion meant he was living under immense pressure. It forced him into two distinct psychological states: periods of intense, hyper-vigilant operational activity, followed by periods of complete enforced stillness in remote locations. He often rented remote estates in places like rural Austria or the Argentine countryside, settling in for weeks under a rock-solid non-commercial alias, simply waiting for the heat to shift. He was the perfect example of a predator who knows when to freeze. This consistent, prolonged avoidance of capture naturally leads to the debate that historians still argue whether the architect was, at any point, working directly for a state intelligence agency. His ability to move seamlessly between Europe and the United States, his knowledge of wartime strategic materials, and his command of multiple languages and document forgery techniques mirror the tradecraft of intelligence agents. Some theories suggest he was occasionally leveraged by one or more governments for short-term espionage or disinformation, his high-level fraud operations providing the perfect cover and funding mechanism. However, the prevailing view remains that his loyalty was purely to his own bank account, and he simply mastered the techniques of spies because they were the most effective tools for his trade. The US Secret Service, T-Men, eventually became his most persistent foe, precisely because they were less interested in his European aristocratic cons and more interested in his counterfeiting activities. The lead agent assigned to him, Agent Frank J. Wilson, an incredibly tenacious and highly methodical investigator, was one of the few men who began to grasp the true scale of Lustig's operations. Wilson started collecting the pieces of the puzzle: the abandoned money box, the reports from the Eiffel Tower scam, the complaints from the Capone organization, and slowly, painfully constructed a composite portrait of the grifter. You imagine yourself as Agent Wilson, staring at a wall covered in photos, aliases, and timelines. The face is the same, but the name changes every 3 months. The accent changes from German to French to American mid-sentence. You realize you're not hunting a man, you're hunting a process. Ultimately, it was the sheer volume of his crimes that led to his eventual capture, not a single brilliant piece of detective work. Lustig's immense wealth required him to engage in massive money laundering, and his chosen method, using a series of genuine but small-time money mules to deposit and transfer cash, created a slow, traceable paper trail that Wilson eventually followed back to a single, legitimate-looking postbox in the Midwest. The chase culminated not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, methodical arrest in a small New York apartment. He was taken into custody not as the elegant Count Lustig, but as Robert V. Miller, an unassuming gentleman with a suitcase full of fake passports and a ledger containing the coded details of his global empire. The chase was over, but the final, most surprising act of his life, the trial and its aftermath, was just beginning. You've witnessed the global chase, the relentless evasion tactics, and the quiet, inevitable moment of capture in a nondescript New York flat. But before we delve into the details of his arrest, we must rewind and examine the one asset that made all his geographic and bureaucratic evasion possible: his cult of personality. This was his invisible shield, his most sophisticated form of insurance, operating long before the age of social media influencers and viral marketing. Our architect didn't just steal money, he stole belief. Think about the sheer scale of the deception. To pull off the Eiffel Tower scam, the diamond mine fraud, and to walk away from Al Capone with his life and a bigger check, he had to be more than just charming. He had to be worshipped, at least by the circle of wealthy individuals who served as his unwitting cover. He mastered the art of selective vulnerability. He never presented himself as a flawless demigod. Instead, he presented himself as a besieged genius, a man with revolutionary, world-changing ideas who was constantly fighting against the petty corruption of governments, the dullness of established banking, and the jealousy of his rivals. When an investment failed, which was of course every investment, he didn't apologize. He lamented that the system was rigged against visionaries like himself, and by extension, against his trusted partners, you, the investor. The core of his personality cult was exclusivity. He only dealt with a select few, always implying that the transaction you were participating in was too big, too sensitive, or too politically volatile for the common man. You weren't a mark, you were a confidant. This made you feel uniquely intelligent and uniquely privileged. He created a social contract where your status was tied to your belief in his success. To admit he was a fraud would be to admit you weren't one of the special people, which was a blow to the ego that most of his wealthy marks could simply not bear to face. This psychological dynamic is a mainstream historical fact in the study of high-level confidence games. When the potential rewards are astronomical, the brain prioritizes the story over the evidence. The grifter supplies the story and the victim supplies the self-delusion. The architect leveraged this by making his transactions inherently opaque, full of non-disclosure agreements, coded language, and secret meeting places, which made the victims feel they were participating in high-level espionage rather than a simple con. Picture yourself as one of his wealthier backers, a man who gave him a substantial investment for the fictional Strategic Material Acquisition Syndicate. The news starts to circulate that the investment has failed. You go to Lustig. He doesn't panic. He sits you down, offers you a fine cigar, and spins a tale of intrigue. His supply lines were sabotaged by a competing government, perhaps the Soviets or the French Secret Service, who feared his revolutionary control over the resource. He shows you a forged document, a quirky or fringe tidbit in his repertoire, that is supposedly a highly classified internal government memo warning officials about the Count's destabilizing influence on the global market. The memo, of course, is utter nonsense, but it's signed with a dozen impressive stamps and is full of threatening official language. You leave the meeting, not angry about your lost money, but secretly proud that your investment was important enough to be targeted by an entire intelligence agency. Lustig didn't refund your money. He reframed your failure as a heroic brush with geopolitical power. He solidified this cult by being meticulously generous and genuinely loyal, but only on small inconsequential matters. If a partner needed a good tailor, Lustig would introduce them to the best in London and pay for the suit. If a friend was going through a tough time, Lustig would send an anonymous, perfectly timed gift. He was constantly building up small reserves of personal goodwill, which were then drawn upon when the big cons collapsed. The partners always thought, he's a genius. He's been unlucky lately, but he is a good man at heart. This raises the complex issue that historians still argue whether the architect's success was fundamentally an economic or a sociological phenomenon. Was the wealth he amassed the primary goal, or was the ultimate objective the power he derived from making incredibly shrewd, powerful people believe an impossible fiction? Some argue his primary drive was narcissistic, the validation of being the smartest man in any room, with the money merely serving as the scorekeeping mechanism. Others maintain that the financial goal was always supreme, and the cult of personality was merely the most effective, self-sustaining security system a criminal could buy. His ability to charm and manipulate was even effective on the women in his life, particularly his long-term partner and occasional wife, which we will discuss in the next section. He had an uncanny ability to turn professional skepticism into personal devotion, often targeting individuals who felt overlooked or underappreciated by their peers. He was the ultimate anti-establishment figure, wrapped in an expensive hyper-establishment suit. He offered his victims a temporary escape from their own mundane, predictable wealth. He offered adventure for a high price. When Agent Wilson finally apprehended him, he noticed a striking detail in Lustig's personal ledger. Next to the names of several known victims, there were small, handwritten notes that said things like, "too vain to tell," "needs to feel," "important," or simply, "bribed." He catalogued his victims not by their cash reserves, but by their core psychological flaw. This ledger was the secret playbook of his cult. Even in custody, he tried to work the system. He famously wrote a letter to the Secret Service promising to cease all counterfeiting activity in the United States and offering them a full accounting of all his scams worldwide in exchange for his freedom. The audacity was astounding, and while the offer was refused, it shows his relentless confidence. He believed he could simply negotiate his way out of federal prison, relying on his persuasive force to cut a deal with the very institution that caught him. He was the living proof that in the interwar period, a compelling enough narrative, delivered with unshakable confidence, was far more powerful than any amount of factual evidence. He didn't need the internet or mass media. He needed one wealthy, well-connected person, and the sheer force of his performance would handle the rest, creating a self-sustaining circle of believers who would ultimately protect him with their silence and their pride. He was a story whispered in the smoky corners of exclusive clubs, and that whisper was louder than any newspaper headline. You've seen the architect build his empire of lies, manage his cult of personality, and outrun the law. But no man, not even a phantom of finance, operates entirely in a vacuum. Every great performance needs a supporting cast, and our grifter, Count Lustig, had one primary, recurring co-star, his wife, or perhaps more accurately his partner, accomplice, an occasional victim, depending on the shifting needs of his current persona. The identity of the woman, or women, who shared his incredibly dangerous nomadic life is as shrouded in mist as his own true name. The records are frustratingly vague, often contradicting each other, which is itself a testament to the man's dedication to compartmentalization. The most consistent figure who travelled with him and served as his official spouse for a significant part of his career was a woman we know primarily by her later documented name, Leota Ranson, though she was known by dozens of aliases herself, from the elegant French Madame Lustig to the mundane Mrs. Miller. Leota was not merely a passive accessory, she was an essential component of the brand. You have to understand the social conventions of the early 20th century, particularly among the elite he targeted. A highly successful man, especially one with a noble title, was expected to have a beautiful, impeccably dressed and discreet wife. Her presence provided instant social camouflage and, critically, moral validation. A gentleman who travels with his lady must surely be a respectable man. Think about the scenes in which she operated. At a formal dinner in Prague or a gambling salon in Monte Carlo, Leota's role was silent, perfect elegance. She never discussed the business. She spoke of art, fashion, and society. She provided the necessary domestic context to the Count's international intrigue. Her very existence suggested stability and wealth. After all, only a very rich man could afford a wife who looked that good and was required to do absolutely nothing. The question of her complicity is the true knot in this historical thread. Was she a knowing participant in the frauds, helping to forge documents or lure victims? Or was she, as some narratives suggest, simply a woman trapped by a life of luxury and deceit, dependent on her charismatic husband but morally uneasy with his crimes? The mainstream historical fact drawn from police reports and later testimony is that she was fully aware of the aliases and the need for instant flight. She was tasked with the logistical complexity of the operation, managing multiple safety deposit boxes in different countries, arranging travel under false names, and maintaining the various, ever-changing residences across Europe and the United States. This level of operational knowledge suggests she was, at the very least, a highly functional accessory to his crimes. Her organisational skill was his anchor. While he was outperforming the con, she was quietly managing the exit strategy. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals the tension and theatricality of their relationship. On more than one occasion, when detectives were closing in, Lustig would reportedly stage a massive, loud, but totally fake argument with Leota in their hotel suite. The shouting match, sometimes involving smashed dishes, would be so convincing that the hotel staff and listening police would assume it was a genuine high-society domestic row, not a prearranged signal, that it was time to activate the contingency plan and move to the next city. The noise was the smokescreen. The silence afterwards meant they were already gone, having slipped out the service entrance during the ruckus. Leota was also used as a psychological tool in the cons themselves. In certain high-stakes scams where a mark was wavering, Lustig would introduce his wife and ask her to confirm a minor detail of their fabricated noble history, or to display a genuine piece of jewellery that he would claim was part of their massive international assets. The mark, seeing the beautiful, soft-spoken woman confirm the details with a sincere smile, would often let their final doubts vanish. The grifter's wife served as the ultimate humanising element of the fraud. However, her position was precarious. She was reliant on a man who could change his entire identity overnight. The risk for her was exponential. If Lustig was caught, she faced potential arrest and prosecution with far less ability to defend herself, as the male-dominated legal systems of the era would naturally view her as the weaker and more easily manipulated partner. Her role required immense discipline and a complete subjugation of her own identity to his narrative. This leads to the question that historians still argue whether Leota Ranson's later documented life, her decision to live under a completely new, quiet identity after Lustig's final arrest, was an act of self-preservation or a true, internal break from the criminal life. Some scholars view her as a tragic figure, coerced into a life of crime by her husband's intense charisma and their shared poverty before the big scores. Others maintain that she was a calculating partner who enjoyed the immense wealth and luxury, and only chose to retreat when the risks finally outweighed the rewards. The only certainty is that she survived the collapse of his empire and managed to disappear completely back into the anonymity of the American landscape, proving she had learned his lessons well. The emotional complexity of their partnership must have been immense. Their lives were a perpetual lie, lived out of suitcases and under assumed names. Imagine the constant tension, the inability to trust anyone, and the necessity of being on stage 24 hours a day. Their marriage was a fundamental pillar of his confidence game, and she was the one who had to hold the entire facade together when the Count was distracted by his next big target. This chapter underscores a universal truth about master grifters. They rarely operate in isolation. They need anchors to the real world, people who handle the logistics, the documentation, and the quiet details of everyday life, so the grifter can remain a pure, unfettered concept. Leota Ranson was that anchor. She allowed the phantom, the architect, to maintain a convincing sense of reality, right up until the point the law finally closed in. Now, with the chase ending in his arrest, Leota fades to the background, having performed her final, most successful trick, vanishing without a trace. The spotlight shifts fully back to the architect, who, even in chains, was already planning his final, most elaborate act of self-preservation. The American system was about to find out what happens when you put the king of counterfeit royalty into a federal penitentiary. You've just seen the curtain fall on his European and North American careers with his quiet arrest. Yet, to think that a federal prison could contain a man whose entire life was a liquid asset is to fundamentally misunderstand his ambition. The arrest was a setback, not a finale. His mind was already moving across the globe, plotting his resurrection. And for a grand, final act of reinvention, he chose the furthest, most culturally distinct theatre available, South America. His time in the custody of the US Secret Service T-men was not spent repenting, it was spent networking. He was released on bail, a massive sum paid almost instantly by a web of his shell companies, and was placed under heavy surveillance. But surveillance for the architect was just a temporary logistical problem. He was legally, if briefly, free. He knew the extradition paperwork from various European countries, combined with the new federal charges of counterfeiting, meant his liberty was measured in hours, not weeks. He needed to disappear completely and permanently from the jurisdiction of the global north. His escape was typically low-key and brilliant. He reportedly slipped away during a pre-arranged, heavily guarded meeting with his attorney in a minor bustling transportation hub, using the chaos of a packed train station and a strategically placed decoy, likely an unsuspecting man wearing a similar coat and fedora, to draw the surveillance teams away. This kind of reliance on misdirection and low-tech theatricality is a mainstream historical fact in the history of escape artistry, proving that confusion is often better than force. His destination was a blank slate, Brazil or Argentina. He didn't choose the obvious high society capitals. He chose slightly rougher, rapidly developing cities, places where massive infrastructure projects were underway, where cash was king, and where the rule of law was frequently an expensive suggestion rather than a very ironclad fact. This was a land of pure, raw opportunity, utterly disconnected from the stifling, tradition-bound systems he had just escaped. In South America, he completely shed the identity of Count Lustig. The European aristocratic veneer was useless here. It signalled weakness or desperation. He needed to become a man of action, industry, and American efficiency. He often chose the identity of Robert V. Miller, the moniker he was using at the time of his arrest, or a similar short Anglo-Saxon name that suggested a no-nonsense industrial background. He arrived with an immense, entirely clean bankroll, thanks to his global resource scams. This liquid capital was the fuel for his final, greatest con, selling expertise to a developing nation. He would present himself as an American infrastructure consultant, a man with years of experience building bridges, railways, and utilities across the globe, ready to apply his unique efficiency-driven approach to the local environment. He didn't sell them fake diamonds, he sold them progress. You, the official of a rapidly industrializing South American state, are desperate for foreign investment and modern solutions. Your capital is beautiful, but your roads are crumbling, and your ports are inefficient. Suddenly a polite, well-spoken American appears, flashing genuine letters of credit from US banks, funded by his laundered money of course, and speaking in meticulous detail about tonnage, tensile strength, and supply chain logistics. He doesn't ask for a bribe. He asks for a partnership and a massive upfront consulting retainer to secure the necessary materials from his vast network of global suppliers. This was the ultimate softcon. Lustig would take the retainer, initiate the planning phase with startling competence, commission real but inexpensive feasibility studies, and start ordering real but symbolic quantities of material. He would create such a convincing whirlwind of activity, constant meetings, phone calls to fictitious head offices in New York, and the hiring of genuine local engineers, that the project seemed utterly real and unstoppable. There is a brilliant quirky or fringe tidbit from this period illustrating his commitment to this new role. He reportedly acquired ownership of a very small failing construction firm in Buenos Aires. He didn't use it to build anything. He used its official stationery, its tiny fleet of aging trucks, and its small staff of workers to provide a real-world tangible cover. When a curious government official asked to see his local operations, he could point to the firm and say, "That is my base of operations." We are busy with the preliminary work. This was not just a fake identity, it was a fake business ecosystem. The brilliance was in the delay. He would ensure the initial phase was so complicated and required so much genuine bureaucratic wrangling, permits, land leases, environmental studies, that months would pass before the actual massive delivery of materials was due. This timeline served as the ultimate escape window. By the time the government realised the major shipments were not coming and that the vast network of suppliers had dissolved into shell corporations, Lustig had already banked the consulting retainer and the funds for the non-existent materials and moved to the next country, ready to become a different kind of expert. This deep dive into his final operational phase brings up the central, final question that historians still argue whether the architect was in fact briefly successful in carrying out a legitimate project amidst his fraud. Some sources suggest that in one of his smaller, less lucrative schemes, perhaps the construction of a small warehouse or a dock repair, he may have actually delivered a serviceable product simply to gain the ultimate level of trust for his subsequent larger swindles. The counter-argument is that true grifters, like sharks, must always be moving and feeding on profit, and any time spent on genuine labour was for him a catastrophic loss of opportunity. Ultimately, South America provided him with a temporary incredibly lucrative refuge and a stunning rebirth. He proved that his criminal principles were universal. Find a society with a burning need, offer a simple, high-status solution, anchor the illusion with a few genuine facts, and vanish with the initial investment before the scale of the required delivery exposes the lie. He arrived as a fugitive, and in the eyes of his newest high-level marks, he became the trusted American benefactor. This time was crucial because it not only netted him another staggering fortune, but it also fundamentally changed his operational risk profile. He was no longer running from the past. He was building a brand new, complex international safety net for his future. He was preparing to leverage his stolen funds to gain genuine, lasting influence. He was ready to stop just playing an industrialist and become one. You have followed the architect across continents, watched him master the chaos of war, and witnessed his latest spectacular rebirth as an industrial consultant in South America. This phase is his most audacious, blurring the line between pure fraud and political influence. He wasn't just stealing cash now. He was using his vast stolen fortune to gain genuine respectability and power, effectively purchasing a seat at the table of nation building. We're in a rapidly developing South American capital, perhaps Rio or Buenos Aires during the mid-1930s. The local government is flush with export revenue but desperately lacks the technical know-how, and more importantly, the untraceable foreign capital to fund ambitious public works projects. Our man, under his robust Robert V. Miller identity, is perfectly positioned to fill that gap. He didn't pitch another massive vanishing infrastructure project. He pitched stability. He offered to finance a smaller, critically important national project, something visible, popular, and absolutely essential for the capital's growth, such as a major port modernisation, a city power grid upgrade, or a specific segment of a national highway. Crucially, he financed this project with his own laundered money disguised as a private development bond or an off-the-books loan. This ability to act as a private sovereign lender using stolen funds is a powerful mainstream historical fact in the history of international corruption. In times of high global volatility and low international scrutiny, wealthy private individuals often stepped in to perform functions typically reserved for national banks or major multinational corporations, gaining immense quiet leverage in the process. Think about the psychological impact on the national leaders. This Mr. Miller is lending them millions, the proceeds of the Diamond Syndicate and the Strategic Materials scam, at favourable terms, asking for nothing but guaranteed government contracts for his fictional American supply network. He wasn't a beggar or a bribe taker, he was a benefactor. He was using his stolen money to buy political legitimacy. He became a temporary respected national infrastructure advisor, sitting in meetings with ministers and presidents, offering genuine, if high-level, advice on finance and logistics. He didn't have to fake competence. Years of running multi-million-dollar frauds had given him a frighteningly sophisticated understanding of global supply chains and financial instruments. He spoke the language of progress, and his confidence was backed by literal tons of illicit cash. His real scam here was twofold: the consultancy fee. He charged an astronomical advisory and management fee, paid directly from the loan amount itself, which was his pure, immediate profit. The supply scam. He would push the government to award massive, guaranteed high markup contracts for materials to his own shell corporations, thereby allowing him to repatriate his laundered funds back into his central control, but this time with a fully legitimate government-issued revenue stream as the paper trail. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit that shines a light on his extravagant lifestyle during this period of pseudo-legitimacy. He reportedly maintained two completely separate, fully staffed estates in two different South American countries. He would fly between them on a leased private aircraft, using the excuse of overseeing the binational development projects. These homes were not just for luxury, they were for security. He had a fully stocked radio room in each estate, allowing him to receive coded warnings from his global network of informants about any inquiries from the Secret Service or European police, ensuring he was always ready for instant flight. The opulence was a necessary part of the confidence game. His success in gaining genuine political influence raises the profound question that historians still argue whether the architect at this stage was genuinely attempting to transition to a legitimate life, using his fraudulent capital to cement a lasting, honest legacy. Some argue that his initial financing of real, albeit small, public works projects shows a desire for genuine respectability. Others counter that this was merely the ultimate level of camouflage. The larger and more visible the front operation, the easier it was to hide the continued smaller frauds running beneath the surface, feeding the constant need for liquid cash. You can imagine the scene. A state dinner where Mr. Miller is toasted by a president for his vision and generosity, while somewhere in a bank vault, the funds are being extracted from the accounts of a defrauded London financier. The applause and the official recognition were the final, crucial pieces of his cult of personality. He was validated by a sovereign state. How could he possibly be a fraud? But this proximity to power, this taste of genuine political validation, was also his greatest danger. When you deal with low-level crooks, they just want their money back. When you deal with national leaders, the stakes become existential. The local political enemies of the leaders he advised began to ask uncomfortable questions about the American benefactor. His success was too fast, his past too vague, and his money too plentiful. The heat was no longer external, from the T-men. It was internal, from local political rivals. The very system he was trying to use for his final massive liquidation was starting to reject him. He was no longer just dealing with greedy individuals. He was dealing with the volatile, unpredictable reality of developing world politics. The stage was set not for a spectacular boom, but for an inevitable slow-motion internal collapse. The man who had defeated the organised forces of law and order would be brought down by the disorganised, messy business of human paranoia and political rivalry. You've watched the architect, now comfortably posing as the high-status Robert V., Miller achieve a position of near legitimacy in the sun-drenched halls of a South American government. He has been toasted by politicians, his advice has been heeded, and his money has been legally laundered through public works contracts. For a moment, it seems he might truly have pulled it off. A genuine, permanent transition from a life of international fraud to a life of powerful, respected wealth. But the central tension of any grifter's life is that the lie is fundamentally unsustainable. The larger the system you build, the more points of failure you create, and the closer you get to people who won't be easily fooled. The downfall of Mr. Miller was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, grinding process, like rust eating away at a finely tuned machine. It began with paranoia. The problem with creating a perfect lie is that you are the only one who knows the truth. Every compliment, every handshake, every signed contract was a constant internal reminder of the abyss beneath his feet. He had to assume every new face was an undercover agent, every friendly inquiry a trap, and every delay a deliberate conspiracy against him. The vast network of informants he paid was a double-edged sword. The constant stream of minor warnings, a European passport inquiry here, a customs official asking questions there, kept him alive but eroded his mental stability. He began making small, uncharacteristic errors. He'd overpay his informants, making them conspicuous. He'd insist on overly complex, illogical contract clauses that only served to draw more attention to his financial manoeuvring. And most importantly, he began to reuse old techniques out of habit rather than necessity. For instance, he briefly reverted to a version of the Eiffel Tower scam, trying to sell a fictitious concession for the rights to scrap a derelict, but politically sensitive government building. This regression to past successful behaviour is a key trait of high-level criminals under stress, and is a mainstream historical fact in the study of recidivism. Why invent a new fraud when the old ones worked so well? But in the volatile political landscape of South America, this kind of scheme was seen not as a clever financial manoeuvre, but as an act of political destabilisation, attracting the attention of local security services who operated outside the niceties of international law. This mounting internal pressure and external political scrutiny inevitably created cracks in his perfectly tailored facade. He began to alienate the key figures he had worked so hard to cultivate. He shifted from being the charming, smooth benefactor to the demanding, temperamental creditor. The politicians he had lent money to started seeing him not as a lifeline, but as a liability. A powerful, wealthy outsider whose past could at any moment explode and damage their careers. This period of creeping realization raises the significant question that historians still argue whether the architect's downfall was ultimately self-inflicted, a consequence of his internal psychological deterioration, or if it was an inevitable result of the sheer tenacity of Agent Frank J. Wilson and the American Secret Service. Some scholars believe that no amount of paranoia would have stopped him had he not been so focused on maintaining his status in South America, while others point to the relentless paper trail assembled by the T-men as the true ticking time bomb. A brilliant, quirky or fringe tidbit that demonstrates his self-inflicted wounds during this period involves his communication with the United States. Despite having successfully escaped the T-men's custody, he occasionally sent cryptic, taunting postcards to Agent Wilson's office, stamped from various obscure international locations. He saw this as a triumphant signature, a way of proving his continued superior intellect. But those postcards were a continuous, authenticated, and highly valuable stream of intelligence, confirming his general geographic location to the relentless agents, and confirming his psychological profile as an arrogant egotist who couldn't resist a final boast. He was his own worst enemy. The political environment provided the final catalyst. A change in government, a common occurrence in the region, brought a new set of leaders to power who had no personal loyalty to Mr. Miller and who were politically motivated to scrutinise every contract signed by the previous regime. They didn't see a benefactor, they saw an opportunity. They didn't have to prove he was a thief, they only had to prove his contracts were illegal or unpatriotic. An official investigation began, not into his past European frauds, but into the legality of his current massive infrastructure deals. The moment an official body began demanding access to the actual deeds, the true, inevitable nature of his entire South American enterprise was laid bare. The vast American supply network dissolved back into a series of postbox addresses. The private development bonds were found to be secured by the ghost assets of his old diamond mine syndicate. The money was legitimate, having been laundered through his previous scams, but the source of his capital and the purpose of his shell companies were too murky to withstand honest scrutiny. He received the inevitable coded warning, not from a local policeman, but likely from a high-level administrative clerk who remembered his generosity and was willing to pay back a debt of honour. The investigation was moving from contracts to criminal charges. The slow-motion collapse was complete. He had to run again, but this time he was a known target on 3 continents, and the global political environment was infinitely more hostile. He had to abandon his immense fortune, his prestige, and his perfected identity. The architect prepared for his final frantic flight, a flight that would lead straight into the waiting hands of a disgruntled former friend. You watch as the edifice of Mr. Miller, the respected benefactor, crumbles under the weight of political scrutiny. The signal has been given. The game is up in South America. Our architect, recognizing the sound of an honest government audit, abandons his opulent estates and liquidates whatever portable assets he can, converting vast sums into diamonds and gold coinage, the currency of the true fugitive. This final frantic flight across the equator begins, but this time the element of surprise is gone. The Secret Service knows his methods, the mob knows his face, and critically, his own network of associates is beginning to turn. The turning point was not the police, it was betrayal. The architect, for all his genius, had one flaw: his inability to pay back a debt of fear. You recall his previous relationship with Al Capone, where he paid back the initial sum to earn the trust for the larger con. His other associates, the men he hired to handle his document forgeries, his money laundering and his logistics, were not always treated with the same theatrical generosity. They were disposable tools, and one of them decided that the reward for turning him in now far outweighed the risk of remaining silent. The informant was a low-level, but crucial figure in his American operation, a man named Tom Denton, likely an alias himself. Denton was the individual responsible for managing the network of money mules that funneled Lustig's illicit profits back into US banks, the very paper trail Agent Wilson had been diligently following. Denton had been paid well, but he was also constantly threatened and belittled by Lustig, who viewed him as a necessary piece of plumbing. When the T-men finally cornered Denton, the man folded instantly, trading the identity and likely location of the legendary Grifter for immunity and a substantial payout. This betrayal provided the relentless Agent Wilson with the single most crucial piece of information he had sought for years: the architect's true active location and his current method of communication. Denton revealed that Lustig, despite his paranoia, was still maintaining a small discreet residence, a final, isolated retreat on an island in the Caribbean, using it as a central relay for his coded communications and a storage locker for his most valuable physical assets. The subsequent manhunt was a cinematic clash between the old world of cunning and the new world of coordinated interagency law enforcement. Wilson and his T-men leveraged their new information, working in perfect, unprecedented harmony with the US Coast Guard, European police contacts, and even a few unofficial favours called in from the Capone organisation, who still harboured a grudge. The net was drawn tight around the Caribbean. This highly coordinated cross-border cooperation is a mainstream historical fact that marked a critical shift in 20th century law enforcement. Lustig, the master of bureaucratic friction, was now facing a seamless, united front. You, following the relentless pursuit, track Lustig to a small, isolated island, perhaps near the Bahamas. He isn't living opulently here. He is living securely. The retreat is fortified with basic, low-tech security measures, and he communicates only via highly encrypted, for the time, radio bursts and coded telegrams, believing himself impervious to surveillance. But the T-men had his communications blueprint. They intercepted one of his coded messages, a seemingly innocuous, quirky or fringe tidbit detailing an arrangement for a shipment of antique furniture, a common code for cash and valuables, which confirmed his presence on the island. The final chase ended not on a bustling city street, but in a quiet, early morning raid. Lustig, always anticipating a gunfight, was prepared, but he was overwhelmed by the sheer methodical force of the coordinated agencies. He was taken into custody yet again, but this time the bail was impossible. The extradition requests were waiting, and the mountain of evidence, patiently assembled by Agent Wilson over years, was insurmountable. His immediate reaction to capture was astonishingly consistent with his character. He reportedly tried to bribe the arresting officers, not with a small sum, but a truly massive amount of cash, offering them more money than they would see in 10 lifetimes of public service. He truly believed that every man had his price, and every problem could be solved with cash. The officers, being federal agents of the US Secret Service, refused the staggering bribe, demonstrating a level of integrity that Lustig had spent his entire life successfully arguing was a myth. His failure to buy his freedom, even at this final hour, underscores the central lesson of his life. He could deceive individuals, outsmart bureaucracies, and charm nobility, but he could not corrupt a truly dedicated, centralized system of justice. The cat-and-mouse game was officially over. The capture led to immediate extradition to the United States to face federal charges related to counterfeiting, a charge that carried the most severe penalties, and which the T-men had patiently built the strongest case around. He was brought back to New York, the scene of his early triumphs, but this time he was not leaving the dock as a free man. The drama of his final chase and capture sets the stage for the next phase of his story, the legal process. His trial would become a secretive, highly complex and ultimately forgotten footnote in the history of American jurisprudence, a final, fitting piece of historical oblivion for the man who was too successful to be remembered. This moment of final defeat raises a fascinating debate that historians still argue whether the architect, upon his capture, felt regret or simply professional frustration. Some scholars argue that his attempt to bribe the officers shows a deep pathological lack of moral compass, viewing his capture as a mere logistical error. Others contend that his lifelong habit of maintaining his aliases, even in custody, never revealing his true origins, suggests a final, profound pride in his craft. He might be defeated by the system, but he would never yield his true self to it. The curtain was rising on the one performance he couldn't control, the trial. You followed the pursuit, the capture, and the relentless journey back to the United States. Our architect, now firmly identified by the US Secret Service as Victor Lustig, stands accused in a federal courthouse in New York. This should have been the trial of the century, a sensational exposé detailing how one man sold the Eiffel Tower, fleeced Al Capone, and ran global resource scams that spanned 3 continents. Yet, it was the trial of the century that nobody saw, a quiet, meticulous legal proceeding that achieved its goal of justice precisely by avoiding the spectacle. The central reason for the media's silence is a mainstream historical fact, often employed by governments in matters of high-level fraud: the deliberate suppression of the full scope of the crimes. The US government, particularly the Treasury Department and the Secret Service, was intensely focused on the counterfeiting charges, the one crime that directly implicated the integrity of American currency and which carried the easiest path to conviction. Publicising the scope of Lustig's other, greater scams would have meant revealing that America's wealthiest citizens, including high-level political figures and financial institutions, were spectacularly gullible. It would have meant admitting that an Austrian immigrant successfully conned Al Capone and lived. The shame factor was immense. Therefore, the trial was kept deliberately narrow. The prosecution focused laser-like on the recovered counterfeiting plates, the remnants of his money box and Capone schemes, and the testimony of his low-level accomplice, Denton, who provided unassailable proof of Lustig's intent to flood the United States with bogus $100 bills. This controlled narrative allowed the T-men to claim a victory against a serious threat to the nation's financial security, without admitting how long and how completely he had evaded capture while running global financial empires. Imagine yourself in the quiet, mahogany-panelled courtroom. Lustig, always the performer, is impeccably dressed, retaining his elegant demeanour even in the defendant's box. He doesn't look like a common crook. He looks like a respected, if momentarily beleaguered, foreign businessman. His defence was complex and typical of a grifter's final stand. He argued that the fake money was a prop, part of a harmless confidence game designed only to extract money from other willing criminals, like Capone. He argued the money was never meant to be passed as genuine. He was selling a story about counterfeiting, not actually committing the crime itself. However, the Secret Service's evidence was too solid. Agent Frank J. Wilson, the man who had dedicated years to the chase, provided meticulous, detailed testimony connecting Lustig to the production of the counterfeit plates. The jury was convinced that the plates were real, and the intent was criminal. This legal proceeding illuminates a quirky or fringe tidbit about Lustig's character. During the trial, he reportedly spent more time charming the jury foreman and the court stenographers during recesses than he did consulting with his own high-priced lawyer. He maintained his innate need to win over every individual, even when facing a life sentence. He saw the legal process not as a search for truth, but as one final, large-scale social engineering effort. He was trying to sell the jury the ultimate illusion that he was a victim of circumstance, not a master criminal. His efforts were in vain. He was found guilty on multiple counts of counterfeiting and conspiracy. The verdict was anticlimactic. The massive drama of his life ended not with a bang of global financial collapse, but with the quiet formality of a federal judge reading a conviction. The sentence was severe: 15 years in the infamous Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary for the counterfeiting charges, plus an additional 5 years for having escaped custody while out on bail years earlier. 20 years in Alcatraz, the rock that symbolised the absolute end of the road for the nation's most incorrigible criminals. The man who lived without boundaries was to be imprisoned within the most rigid boundaries imaginable. This entire selective legal process leads to the core question that historians still argue whether the US government made a catastrophic error in failing to prosecute Lustig for his larger financial scams. Some argue that by focusing solely on counterfeiting, the government missed the opportunity to recover the hundreds of millions of dollars he stole from American citizens and corporations. Others maintain that by securing a conviction on the strongest charge and sending him to Alcatraz, they removed the most dangerous financial phantom of the era, and any attempt to untangle his global financial shell game would have dragged the case on for decades, risking acquittal. The fact remains that by prosecuting the counterfeit artist, they allowed the world's greatest grifter to retain the vast majority of his ill-gotten wealth. You watch as the doors of Alcatraz clang shut on the man who called himself Count Victor Lustig. The man who had charmed his way across 2 continents and multiple governments was now just inmate number 307. He was confined, but he was far from finished. His wealth, strategically hidden and securely diversified, would outlast his imprisonment, and his final act of self-determination would take place not in court, but in the prison infirmary. He was stripped of his freedom, but not his fortune. You left the architect, Count Victor Lustig, confined within the inescapable walls of Alcatraz, stripped of his freedom but not his cunning. A 20-year sentence on that cold, foggy rock was intended to be the ultimate crushing punishment for the man who believed himself above all law. Yet, even in prison, the story of the grifter doesn't end in penury. It ends in a stunning, almost unbelievable continuation of his privileged status. His wealth, carefully diversified across continents, proved to be more durable than the American federal prison system. Alcatraz was designed to break men, but Lustig was less susceptible to psychological warfare than others. The isolation and the routine, while tedious, gave him the one thing he always craved: absolute control over his information flow. No one could track him, bribe him, or con him within those walls. He used his time to quietly manage his assets through a sophisticated network of attorneys and trusts established years earlier in neutral territories. The mainstream historical fact, often obscured by the sensationalism of his crimes, is that the US government recovered only a tiny fraction of the money he stole, mostly the physical counterfeit plates and a small amount of cash seized upon his arrest. The vast fortunes from the Eiffel Tower scam, the Diamond Syndicate, and the South American infrastructure frauds remained securely sequestered in Swiss bank accounts, Panamanian trusts, and liquid assets like gold and bearer bonds. His financial structure was a masterpiece of legal evasion. He quickly learned to navigate the prison system not through violence but through subtle manipulation. He used his charm and his knowledge of multiple languages to gain favour with guards and, more importantly, with key administrative staff. He offered small, seemingly innocuous bribes, not of cash, but of informational favours, to secure preferential treatment, like access to the prison library or extra time in the yard. His life sentence was merely a new high-security social network he had to manage. But the final, most decisive move in his story of evasion was medical, not legal. His health, battered by years of stress, constant travel and poor habits, began to deteriorate in the late 1930s. He developed pneumonia and other complications, leading to his transfer from the notorious isolation of Alcatraz to the comparative comfort of the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. This transfer, far from the isolation and oversight of the Rock, was the first crack in the system that allowed the wealthy exile to begin. His time in the federal medical facility became less about rehabilitation and more about managed decline. He was, for all intents and purposes, retired, living under the care of the federal government, but enjoying a lifestyle that, by prison standards, was astonishingly comfortable. There is a grim, quirky or fringe tidbit associated with his time at Springfield. He reportedly befriended a small-time counterfeiter in the infirmary, and instead of teaching him a new scam, Lustig spent his time detailing the 10 commandments of the conman to him, almost as if he were penning his final philosophical testament. He couldn't resist the urge to teach, even when his greatest lesson was his own failure to escape. He remained the ultimate teacher of deception, passing on his operational gospel to anyone who would listen. The ultimate question that historians still argue whether Victor Lustig was a genuine criminal mastermind or merely an extraordinary lucky product of a chaotic historical era is given its final ironic answer by his death. He died in the medical centre in 1947, aged approximately 57. The official cause of death was pneumonia, but the underlying factor was the cumulative stress of a life lived entirely as a lie. He was legally convicted, sentenced to 20 years, and died in federal custody. The system, technically, won. Yet, his legacy is one of the most successful criminal careers in history. He died a wealthy prisoner. The moment the news of his death was confirmed, his meticulously planned trusts and foundations began the final process of transferring his liquid assets to his designated, long-hidden heirs. He maintained his fortune, secured his legacy of wealth, and left his pursuers with nothing but a final bitter victory. The man who had been inmate number 307 was buried in an unmarked grave, his wealth having successfully purchased him complete anonymity and freedom from posthumous scrutiny. His story proves that for the master grifter, the goal isn't just to steal the money, it's to secure the lifestyle. He lived a life of unimaginable luxury and escaped the financial consequences entirely. The final act of his life was the perfect con. He convinced the world he was a bankrupt criminal who died in disgrace, allowing his wealth to remain entirely untouched and untraceable. He purchased his own wealthy exile, and the price was simply his physical freedom for a few final managed years. You now stand at the very end of the line, looking back at the life of the man known as Count Victor Lustig, the architect of illusion. He died in federal custody in 1947, a wealthy, if contained, man stripped of his freedom but holding fast to his fortune. This final section isn't about the mechanics of his escape or the scale of his theft. It's about the single, final question that defines his life. Why did the greatest grifter in history vanish from memory? His legacy did not crumble in a spectacular public collapse like Ponzi's. It simply vanished in smoke, like the end of a perfectly executed magic trick. He was too successful, too elegant, and too damaging to the egos of the powerful to be allowed a place in the popular historical narrative. The primary reason for this historical erasure is that his victims were, almost without exception, wealthy, sophisticated, and utterly ashamed. The politicians he bamboozled in South America, the financiers he fleeced in London, and the scrap dealers he deceived in Paris did not want to admit they were fooled by a man who sold them the Eiffel Tower. They preferred to write off the losses as a complex commercial failure or a consequence of political turbulence, rather than confessing to the police that they paid a bribe to a smooth-talking man who didn't exist. This self-enforced silence is a mainstream historical fact that protects nearly all high-level swindlers. The greater the shame, the deeper the silence. Contrast this with figures like Al Capone. The authorities wanted to publicise Capone's downfall to assert the rule of law, but publicising Lustig's crimes would have asserted the rule of stupidity among the elite. The US Secret Service, having finally secured his conviction on counterfeiting charges, was perfectly happy to let the world believe they had caught a serious money printer, rather than a global financial phantom who humiliated them for decades. This leads to the uncomfortable conclusion that the architect achieved his final, greatest con posthumously. He convinced history to forget him. He literally purchased his own anonymity. Think about the structure of his fraud one last time. He never focused on small, defenceless victims. His marks were always men of means, ambition, and most importantly, pride. He didn't just steal their money, he stole their judgment. By targeting their vanity and their greed, he ensured that their self-interest would become his final, strongest defence. This whole phenomenon raises a deep, final philosophical debate that historians still argue whether the erasure of Lustig's legacy is a symptom of a deeper societal discomfort with the concept of the master criminal. Was he forgotten because his crimes were too complex to be understood by the average person, or because his success challenges the comforting notion that true evil always leaves a messy, detectable trail? Some scholars suggest that the myth of the bumbling, eventually caught criminal is necessary for the public to maintain faith in the system, and Lustig's effortless command over that system was simply too disruptive to allow into the history books. He proved that genius, when applied to wickedness, can defeat justice. His life, from the low-level railway cons to the high-stakes political financing in South America, was a testament to the power of pure, confident sound. He was an artist of the spoken word, a genius of the fabricated document, and a master of the non-existent deal. There is a final, highly appropriate quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly encapsulates his enduring ghostly presence. For decades after his death, law enforcement agencies in both Europe and the United States would occasionally receive reports of a man matching Lustig's description, attempting to run a variation of the money box scam or an ancient coin fraud. This was, of course, impossible, but the continued reports, long after he was buried in an unmarked grave, illustrate how thoroughly he had imprinted the idea of the unstoppable grifter onto the public and criminal imagination. He became the patron saint of the high-end confidence man, the ultimate whispered legend. The chase didn't end. It became a self-perpetuating myth. The core of his legacy, then, is not in the money he stole, but in the lessons he taught. Confidence is collateral. The quality of the lie matters less than the unwavering conviction with which it is delivered. Greed is self-punishing. The victim's own hunger for a secret shortcut is the grifter's most valuable tool. Silence is security. The most effective defence is a victim too ashamed or too legally compromised to speak. He was the living embodiment of the axiom, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Victor Lustig performed that trick on the 20th century. He took his secrets, his history, and his enormous, untraceable fortune with him, leaving behind only a faint, intriguing echo. The lights of the story dim now. The Count is gone, his aliases retired, his scams perfected and catalogued only in the deepest, dustiest archives of the US Secret Service. His life was a performance of absolute ambition, and his forgotten legacy is the final brilliant flourish. And now, as we leave the roar of the early 20th century and the quiet tragedy of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower, feel the narrative slow around you, letting the noise of the chase fade away. The architect, who was always running, is finally at rest. The fear is gone, the documents are silent, and the ledger is closed. There is no urgency here, only the soft echo of a world where everything, even a grand national monument, could be bought and sold with a confident smile. Let your shoulders drop and the tension ease from your neck. You've journeyed through a life of endless anxiety and magnificent lies. Remember that feeling of the ship swaying, the heavy silence of the prison rock and the comfort of the final empty estate. That complex man, driven by an unquenchable need for status and wealth, found his final peace in a quiet, forgotten corner. The great drama of his existence resolved into this soft, calming quietness. There are no more secrets to chase, no more aliases to uncover, just the stillness of the night and the gentle hum of your own calm. Rest now. Let the complex webs of international fraud and elaborate lies dissolve like the morning fog. You are safe, settled, and held by the quiet truth that the greatest stories are often the ones you never knew you were supposed to hear.